There are a few times over the course of a year or a series of years when being a priest means that I get to spend the better part of a day at the beach. Yesterday was one of those days as we had this family fun day that me and Nicole and a few others from around the diocese put together as an opportunity to bring families together from all over the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire for just a time of being together, a time for families, many of whom are in churches like our church, where there are not a lot of kids around, there are not a lot of families present, and so there's not always that robust kind of feeling of community. So this fun day was just an opportunity to be together, to have families with kids of various ages, families that look different, with grandparents and parents leading from Francis at 1-year-old, and actually there was a baby even younger, up through 17-year-olds, to bring them all together into one space. And for me, it was a really important reminder of what church is all about and what we're all doing when we show up on Sunday, what is important about this experience. I helped to organize this day, so I had my responsibilities and my duties. I had the tasks that I needed to do over the course of it to make it happen. In the center of this day was an opportunity to go while the tide was way out. We were at Odiorn State Park, to go down by the water, to climb over the rocks, to scramble over seaweed, and to look into the tide pools that were there, to just kind of peer into them, to collect whatever crabs and shrimp and little critters we could find under rocks and scurrying around in those pools. We'd hoped that it would be a fun opportunity for kids to get to know this environment, this ecosystem, and just to wonder in God's creation a little bit. So at some point in the midst of this, I stopped doing all of the logistical things that I needed to do, sat down next to an 11-year-old from another church, and we just looked into this tide pool together. We sat there, we kneeled, crouched beside it for 10, 15 minutes, turning over small rocks, wondering what we could see, paying attention to the slight and contours underneath the water in that area that pool that was maybe just a couple feet wide. And it was amazing the entire world that we discovered there. Things that I would have just passed by normally, that I would have walked right past, that I never would have known. The periwinkles attached to the underside of rocks, small green crabs, and another type of invasive crab. We saw little shrimp darting around. It was this amazing entire ecosystem contained in just a few feet of water, rocks, and kelp. And what really brought that experience alive was just the opportunity to pay attention. And it wasn't just the two of us crouched beside our pool. As I looked around, I saw these children of all ages that were in the same kind of rapture, overlooking into these tide pools and seeing what they just could discover and experiencing that wonder at God's creation and wonder of this entire world unfolding before them. In our gospel story today, we hear about Mary and Martha, these two sisters who welcome Jesus into their home and host him. I think this is one of those stories that gets used in what I think is a pretty reduced way, that ends up not really plumbing the sort of fullness that exists within these two characters. I think so often I've heard this gospel used to ask the question, are you a Mary or are you a Martha? Are you someone who's constantly doing, who has a never-ending to-do list, and you're going through and just attending to all of the details, all of the necessary things in life? Are you constantly moving from one task to the other without ever stopping and smelling the roses? Or are you a Mary, someone who takes time to savor life, to appreciate the world around you, to be present in this very moment and present to the people around you? And I understand why that reading came about, and you can kind of get hints of it here in the text of, Jesus telling Martha that her tasks have caused her to be distracted and praising Mary. But I think to reduce these two women, these two characters to this binary of look at busy Martha who's just doing, and look at good Mary who's taking time to appreciate Jesus' presence, misses the point of the story. and I think isn't entirely fair to who these characters are. There's another way of interpreting this story that isn't about this dichotomy of seeing Martha on one side and Mary the other, and that one is good and one is bad, and that we should all be like one and less like the other. When I think there's another reading that appreciates the fact that we all have way more than it feels like we can handle over the course of a day, a week, a month, over our lives, that we do have our seemingly never-ending to-do lists, that we all have responsibilities that we carry with us. There's another way of interpreting the story that is found even from the earliest years of Christianity, that sees these two figures not as dichotomies or diametrically opposed to one another, but understands that they both reflect parts of our lives, both as human beings and also as people who seek to follow Christ. And that is that we all have to live in and move through the world, and that means that our lives are full of activities, that we find ourselves busy with things that are necessary and good and important. And we could also almost all probably do a better job of being present to the people around us, being present to the task that's immediately before us. And so I read this passage not as Jesus saying that Martha is doing something wrong or that somehow her personality is deficient, but that she has something to learn from Mary. That not that she needs to stop doing what she's doing, not that she should abandon the dinner that she has in the oven, or should not worry about the state of her home, or shouldn't pay attention to the sort of social expectations of what it means to welcome a guest into your house. I think in this corrective that he offers of encouraging her to look at her sister is more about an invitation for her to pay attention, to put things to put her priorities in proper order, to realize that it's not that those tasks that she's doing, the dinner that she's making, aren't an end in themselves, that they aren't important on their own, but that they are important as vehicles to allow her to be present to the people around her, to the guest who she has welcomed into her home. Jesus' invitation to Martha is to pay attention, to see God's presence in her midst, to appreciate the presence of the guest in her home, to take time to be grateful, and also to look deeply, to see what is happening around her, to appreciate that God is there with her, present in her home, and that God's love is being extended to her in that very moment. And that while there may be this seemingly never-ending list of things to do, that is the most important thing, that through everything she should never lose sight of that. Throughout the sort of period of the ancient church and into the Middle Ages, this story became a really central one to many, especially monastic teachers. The 14th century mystic and theologian, monk Meister Eckhart, wrote multiple sermons that he would later publish on this very story, on just these short 4 verses. And for him, it became this paradigm of what he called active contemplation should look like. His interpretation of this story was that the ideal that Jesus sees for Martha, but also for all of his followers, is a sort of marriage of this character of Martha and Mary. That it's a life in which we move through all of the things that we have to do, need to do, ought to do, and want to do, in which we attend to that to-do list that we have, but we do so in a way that never loses sight that God is present all around us, that God is with us, that God is in us, that God is constantly reaching out to us, seeking to draw us closer. This ideal of active contemplation that he wrote about is about turning the entirety of our life into a prayer, into a conversation with God. So that as we're pulling weeds from the garden, chopping vegetables for dinner, as we're sweeping the floors, as we're getting up early to start our morning commute, as we're logging on to yet another Zoom meeting, we never lose sight of the fact that, yes, even in the vast expanse of the internet and of the web, that God is still reaching out to us, is still present with us. That, I think, is what is at the heart of this story. That we ought to pay attention, to continue to look for God's presence all around us. That's what I experienced yesterday at this family fun day, was these children, these families gathered around these tide pools, looking deeply, paying attention to the world around them. These spaces that I would have just walked by and not given a second glance, they were looking at with an attention that sought to appreciate the wonder and mystery and boundless life within them. And that day, the power of that day and my sense of God's presence in it went beyond those tide pools. Later, we had the opportunity to send the kids off to play some games in a field, and for the parents and other adults who were there to just sit and have conversation. And from those conversations, what I heard over and over was just a gratefulness at the opportunity to be together, for these families to come together in that space, for the adults not to have to worry about what their kids were doing, to just send them off to play with new friends and new people, while they just got to sit and talk about things that mattered the most. And as I was trying to wrangle Francis, who wanted to be walking around in every direction and moving everywhere except where I wanted to sit and be a part of this conversation, I had the opportunity to kind of be an outside observer and to watch this conversation unfolding among adults and to hear from these folks how much it mattered just to be together, and the fact that they were experiencing God's presence in that, in the experience of community gathered. And to me, it so held together so nicely with this gospel, this reminder to pay attention, to savor those moments as we move through our lives, to take comfort, to take consolation in those opportunities where we get to see God's presence with us, around us, and among us. And so as we wrestle with this story of Mary and Martha and try to move beyond this interpretation that assumes that we are either one thing or the other, I hope that we might all take from it this goal of living a more integrated life, in which, as we move through our days and move through that constant list of things, we never lose the opportunity to pay attention, to stop even for a few seconds here and there, for a few moments here and there, and to realize that in all that we do, God is with us, God is all around us, and God is reaching out to us, seeking to draw us closer. Only one thing is needed: to pay attention to that presence moving within us, among us, and all around us.